when I talk to people about my thesis, they're like, after breast cancer, people have trouble with their arms. I'm like, yeah, yeah, uh, of course they do. It's so obvious to me and it's obvious to you, but it's not to everybody. And so people don't think, maybe I should get into rehab because it's a trauma. It's a trauma like anything else. And, you have to work through that to make sure that these deficits don't happen, right? And like even through those low load tasks, right? You seeing those differences like that creates a whole host of other things, like the fatigue. Working at that percentage for everyday tasks, like of course you're tired at the end of it. Like you feel not only emotional, mental fatigue, but physical fatigue because you just worked so much harder than any other person to complete. So like I said, we thought that force would increase as time passed, and that actually wasn't true. So we saw a decrease in extension, external rotation, flexion, and internal rotation. So extension was 30 newtons less, external rotation 28 newtons less, flexion 35, and internal rotation was 44 newtons less. And these were all significant, but if you look at abduction and adduction, you can see the same trend. They just were more variable, so it didn't come out in the stats. We also found that same trend in muscular activation, that there was a difference, but actually muscular activation increased for the pectoralis major muscle during these force exertions. So we saw increased activation and decrease in force. And then if we look at some of our activities of daily living, we saw the same thing. The group further from treatment had more restricted motion. So at the shoulder, we talk about plane of elevation angle, and axial rotation. So plane of elevation is horizontal abduction, the movement across and kind of like where you're lifting your arm. Elevation angle is how high, obviously, and then axial rotation, we have kind of our internal, external rotation of motion. And so again, we saw less plane of elevation, about 12 degrees less of plane of elevation being used during these low load tasks. So we have a bag lift, a 5 kilogram bag lift, clasping a bra, putting on a necklace, pouring from a pitcher, reaching forward with a 1 kilogram weight, and reaching up to a shoulder height shelf with a 1 kilogram weight. And so over all of those motions, and you'll see on my screen where those were significant. There's some asterisks, but across most of the motions, we saw differences in all of these planes of motion. So 12 degrees less of plane of elevation, 30 degrees less elevation angle through these low load tasks, and 22 degrees reduction in axial rotation in the group further from treatment. So we can see on these graphs, our low score cluster is in red and the high score cluster is in black. And we see percent of tasks along our x-axis and the angle along the y. And so across these tasks, we see these marked areas with an asterisk, and those are where it was significantly different between the two groups. And what we see is that the high score cluster, or the black line, is using more of that plane of elevation angle, and axial rotation. So in plane of elevation and axial rotation, it appears that the low score cluster is using more because the line is higher. But actually, if you look at where it starts, they're using less because they don't reach that same maximum. And then in elevation angle, we can see the low score cluster using less quite clearly. And so across these three planes of motion, we see about a 10-degree difference. But what I want to point out more so is that this restriction happens kind of through the entire movement. We see a smaller band, but a greater amount of variability. So the shaded area is our variability. So they are completing this motion much differently from one another in that low score cluster. The variability is increased, but the mean of that, so like the average motion, is much more restricted. And the same trend happened in the forward reach. And there was a couple of times where, we were like, do we open it up to 5 years? And we really just stuck to our guns and said, no, like these first 2 years, it's important. It's important to keep it tight.